Russian Tradition and Orthodoxy: A Historical Background for Understanding Peter the Great. Peter the Great ruled Russia from 1682 to 1725. 57 years after his death, this famous statue of Peter pointing west on horseback was unveiled to a crowd of thousands. The tension between Peter's vision for Russia and the other influences on Russian culture is the subject of tomorrow's class. In other words, is this statue an object of celebration or an object of blasphemy? To decide, let's pick up the story in 1453, when the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople. Constantinople had been the home of Orthodox Christianity for at least 400 years, ever since the Catholics and the Orthodox finally split from one another in 1054. With the fall of Constantinople, Orthodoxy needed a new capital, and by about 1500, that center had become Moscow. Moscow was known as the Third Rome, since the first, Rome in Italy, had been replaced by Constantinople, and Constantinople had fallen to the Muslims. Some might see Moscow as an unlikely candidate for the capital of Orthodoxy, for in 1453, Moscow was still a city of wood buildings and wood battlements. More importantly, it was so much on the periphery that few considered the state of Muscovy to be a European nation. Even Russians considered themselves to be as much Asian as they were European. They did not see the West as having the spiritual answers or models for society to emulate. Just as the Russians saw Westerners as being other, Westerners saw Russians as being other too. Things began to change in the 1500s, however, when Orthodoxy gained its first victory over the Muslims since the fall of Constantinople. This victory came in 1552 when Tsar Ivan IV led a Russian army to the Muslim city of Kazan to rescue 100,000 Russians who had been enslaved there. Here we see the Muslims surrendering to Ivan. Upon his return to Moscow, Ivan IV was hailed as Ivan Grozny, the Russian word for awe-inspiring or terrible. Ivan the Terrible is a controversial figure, portrayed more sympathetically by those who emphasized the early years of his reign and portrayed more harshly by those who emphasized the second half of his reign. Ivan IV is important for us because to celebrate his historic victory over the Muslims in Kazan, Ivan IV ordered the building of a new cathedral on what is now called Red Square. This was to be an important structure, a place to confirm that Moscow had truly taken the place of Constantinople as the center of Orthodox Christianity. The cathedral was to be situated just outside the walls of the Kremlin, which was the home fortress of the Tsars. The result was the Cathedral of Vasily the Blessed, or as it is commonly known, St. Basil's Cathedral. The cathedral was finished in 1561 and remains the most well-known example of Russian church architecture. As I hope you can see, there are two prominent elements to this structure, the domes and the central tower. From where do these two architectural styles come? Let's look at the dome first. The onion dome is the most characteristic piece of Russian architecture, even if it's a bit unclear as to where this feature originated. The most likely explanation is that it was an adaptation of the broader Byzantine dome, as seen here in the famous Hagia Sophia in Constantinople on the right. This style came to Russia with the spread of Christianity beginning in the 9th century. Russia's heavy snows required a steeper pitch of roof, however, and over time the broad, flat domes of Byzantium were reshaped into the onion dome. Symbolically, however, the onion dome evokes the Byzantine heritage, the continuity to the Third Rome, and the power of Orthodoxy's tradition. One early characteristic of Russian Orthodox churches is that they were quite simple on the outside, as shown here in a church near Novgorod which was built in 1198. The interiors of these churches were highly decorated, however, and the architectural message was also a spiritual one. Be modest in your appearance to the outside world, but be full of spirituality and deep spiritual life in your heart. As time passed, onion dome churches were replaced with churches with multiple domes. By the 16th century, a new architectural style had become popular in Russia, and it is known as the tent style. One early example of the tent style can be seen at the church of Kolminskoye outside of Moscow, which was built to commemorate the birth of Ivan IV in 1530. In fact, one easy way to date Russian churches is to see if a church has any tent style element to it. If it does, it was built after 1500. What St. Basil's does is combine both Russia's traditional dome architecture with the new tent style. Originally, it was painted on the outside monochromatically in the Russian tradition. But then in the 17th century, the Russian court became influenced by an Italian architect who wanted to do something very different. And he gave St. Basil's its distinctive color scheme. The Italian architect seems to have been able to convince the Russians to apply the character of the exuberant interior to the outside of the church for the first time. With the exuberance on the outside, the interior was originally left plain. And so St. Basil's then is a unique result of the integration of Russian styles and an unconventional color scheme. Here are some more details of the exterior, just so you can get a sense for how it is colored and decorated. It is worth noting that the interior of the original St. Basil's was plain. This was to complete the reversal of the traditional Russian Orthodox church style. But people hated this adaptation and disliked the interior so much that it too was eventually decorated in biblical stories and saints' lives. This is the iconostasis, which is in the largest of the 9 chapels, and which I hope you remember is the wall that separates the nave from where people pray in public from the sanctuary and the altar, which is reserved for the priests. This is a tradition that upholds the mystery of the transformation of the host and one of the things that distinguishes Orthodoxy from Catholicism. Just underneath the main chapel is the tomb of St. Basil, who is a local saint. And just to the left of the tomb is this doorway. This arch and the decorations surrounding it is one of the things that symbolizes Russia's traditional heritage for me. It was a place that was profoundly Orthodox and decidedly not European. Not only did Russians think of themselves as being Eastern instead of European, but by the time of Peter's death, they had not experienced any of the things which so much dominated the rest of the European experience. There had not been, for example, an end to serfdom or the rise of a merchant class. Russia had not experienced the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Scientific Revolution, or the Reformation. Indeed, Russia was still very much a rural, medieval society, dominated by lords hundreds of years after Western Europe had entered what historians call the modern age. It was into this very traditional world that Peter Romanov was born. Almost from the outset, and certainly by the time he becomes Tsar at the age of 10 in 1682, Peter the Great chafed under the atmosphere of the Kremlin. He hated the rituals, he hated the restrictions, and he hated his half-sister Sophia, who served as regent. In our next class, we will examine how Peter responds to these feelings and what this image of him proudly wearing Western dress says about his relationship with nearly everyone around him. Thank you.